Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Africa podcast. I'm your host, Andy. Last episode, we left off with Kilwa in a state of seemingly unending strife and civil conflict. While the state had returned to a status of economic prosperity, the competition to control and wield Kilwa's power had become more and more intense. Decades of strife between two prominent families led to a power-sharing agreement between the Wasil and Mahdi families, only for that agreement to fall apart immediately upon the ascension of a triumvirate of powerful brothers. Upon the death of the Sultan, two of those brothers, Emir Muhammad and Vizier Suleiman, had attempted to seize the government, only for their effort to be, short-lived. It would be the first and far from the last instance of such a coup in Kilwa's history. Today we enter an age of political intrigue like no other, with the rise of a new ruling, bureaucratic class that will surpass even the power of the sultanate itself. Season 6, Episode 15, The Unstable 15th Century Part 2, Emir Muhammad the Powerful. By the end of the rule of the brothers Muhammad and Suleiman, the multi-generational conflict that had defined Kilwa in the first half of the 15th century had not yet abated, but had only intensified. Their fall had not seen the return of consensus or stability to Kilwa Kisiwani, but rather the emergence of yet another era of seemingly unending civil unrest and warfare. The brothers Muhammad and Suleiman were ousted by 1454, yet their substantial network of old allies continued to vie for the power of the Sultanate for years afterwards. The next 24 years of Kilwa's history were defined by unending disputes, assassinations, uprisings, revolts, coups, and much more, culminating in what can only be regarded as one of the darkest periods in Kilwa's history. Of course, this constant civil strife had significantly diminished the island's prestige and its economic conditions by the end of the 1460s. The island's great mosque, which had been repaired decades prior, had begun to fall into disrepair once again, and this time it seemed like the ruin might just be permanent. One particular anecdote illustrates Kilwa's decline during this period particularly well. Of course, since the rise of the Mahdi dynasty, Kilwa's familial and cultural connections with Yemen in southern Arabia and Zanzibar on the east coast of Africa had become particularly advanced. It was not uncommon for wealthy families, especially those of noble roots, to possess familial ties in each region, with separate branches of the same family residing in each of those locations. Perhaps the most important of these familial branches were the distant cousins of Kilwa's ruling family, known as the Rasulids of Yemen. Now, the Rasulids by this point had ruled Yemen for more than 200 years, and their period of rule was generally regarded as one of the most prosperous and advanced times in Yemen's history. And their long period of rule was generally known as one of the most prosperous, innovative, and architecturally significant periods of Yemen's history. However, around the end of this period, things had changed quite a bit for the worse, and their situation was even worse than that of Kilwa. I could get into this for a while, as the fall of the Rasulid dynasty is quite an interesting story, but in summary, the Rasulids had been gradually losing their grasp on power for decades, with the kings of Yemen delegating more and more power to important noble families of their kingdom. Since most of the levies that formed the armies wielded by the kings of Yemen came from these noble families, their only independent source of military power came from their enslaved soldiers, or Mamluks. Over time, the Rasulids became more and more dependent on the Mamluks to crush ambitious nobles who didn't know their place, but the dynasty began to truly lose its grip on power when, in 1442, the Mamluks revolted against the Rasulid king. Instead, the king of Yemen was forced to call on those very same noble families that he had crushed for years, and while the revolt of the Mamluks was defeated, the Rasulids were now in a totally dependent position from their supposed vassals, and independently, they were quite powerless. When one of these noble families, the Tahirids, rose up and seized power, the last Rasulid king was forced to surrender without a fight, and he would live the rest of his life in quiet retirement traveling around the Indian Ocean. Due to his familial connections, Kilwa had been one of the king's more frequent stops, and whenever he had visited Kilwa, he'd always been impressed with the city's wealth, prestige, and generosity. However, following the decades of civil war that had defined Kilwa, when the former king began his return visit in the 1470s, An anonymous Kilwa noble apparently informed him about the city's dire conditions and asked him to leave for, well, his own sake. They stated to him, quote, "We ask that you do not come to visit again. The country is no longer how it used to be, and we are of much less means than before. Please avoid coming here so that our poor conditions are not exposed, and you may not be ashamed." Yeah, that might be the single worst tourism pitch I've ever heard in my entire life, and it showcases just how far Kilwa had fallen by this point. The city that had once found a way to stand out even to the most well-traveled men of all time, the most impressive glistening metropolis on the Indian Ocean coast of Africa, was now reduced to a place that was actively telling people not to stay away in an effort to hide shame at their decay. Ouch, that's got to sting. And as if that wasn't bad enough, things were only going to get worse from here. Around 1476, the Sultan of Kilwa unexpectedly passed away, and his distant half-brother, the Vizier Suleiman ibn Yarik, rose up, overthrew the late Sultan's heir, and seized power for himself. And no, I feel the need to clarify here that you did not select the wrong episode by mistake. If you're feeling a fair amount of deja vu, that is perfectly understandable though. Yes, in our last episode, so too did a vizier named Suleiman seize power by force, and not only that, but this Suleiman ibn Yarik is going to appoint one of his brothers, who happens to be named Muhammad, as the new Emir. Just like last time. Now, I get that Suleiman and Muhammad are like the most common names ever, and that Kilwa has experienced dozens of usurpations and rebellions at this point, but the odds that it would line up in such a perfect way almost made me skeptical that this even happened. I strongly considered that maybe there was just some disjunction between the versions of the Chronicle, and they're actually describing the same event, or like, maybe someone, I don't know, failed to flip over a page when copying an earlier document and accidentally listed Suleiman's rise to power twice? Well, as it turns out, the answer is actually no. I couldn't find anything to back up any of these ideas, and it seems very likely that this is in fact a separate event in history, but one that just so happens to rhyme with what came before. The first pair of brothers, Suleiman and Muhammad, just so happen to share the same names, roles, and status as usurpers, as the next pair of usurping brothers. The reason we can be pretty sure about this is that their stories, while they sound kind of similar at first, do begin to noticeably diverge in a few different ways, and indeed, both stories are recorded in both versions of the Chronicle. Suleiman ibn Yarik and the earlier Suleiman are clearly intended to be understood in the Chronicle as different people, and their periods of power are seen as entirely separate historical events. The coincidence of their names is, well, just that, a coincidence. And given how much we've seen that the royal family of Kilwa likes to name people like the same 4 things over and over again, yeah, it definitely tracks that would be the case. As it turned out, this wouldn't be the only part of that story that would rhyme, as the new Vizier Suleiman ibn Yarik got off to the same rocky start as his predecessor. With his usurpation being thoroughly unpopular, much of the local nobility did not respect his wishes to fulfill the obligations of taxation and the like, and so he turned to good old-fashioned despotism to get things done. Now, as per usual, the Chronicle provides very little detail in terms of his supposed despotism. All it really gives us is that he became especially tight-fisted with revenue and proclaimed a policy of financial austerity. As has traditionally been the case, this was not very popular among Kilwa's population, and rumors of an impending revolt began to spring up almost immediately. And yeah, just like those who had come before him, the former vizier turned sultan wouldn't last long in power. However, he would end up playing a crucial role for the rest of Kilwa's history through one particular action, when he appointed a man whose life and legacy would become synonymous with the later periods of Kilwa's history. This man was his brother, the Emir, who was named Muhammad ibn Muhammad Al Kawab, a name which roughly translates to Muhammad the Pillar or Muhammad the Column. Conveniently enough, just like in English, the word for pillar or column in Arabic holds a metaphorical significance as well as a literal one, referring not only to the object that holds up a building, but also metaphorically to someone who holds up their community or plays an essential role in leadership. Due to this metaphorical significance, translations of the Kilwa Chronicle will often refer to him as Muhammad the Vital or Muhammad the Powerful. Now, there is some degree of likelihood that this translation too is not entirely accurate, and the word here, Kawab, might stem from a similar sounding Persian word meaning junior or below, referring to his status as being below his brother when first appointed. But regardless, Al Kawab, as I will call him from henceforth, will certainly become a pillar of Kilwa, regardless of his name's intended meaning, and will end up becoming the most influential leader in Kilwa's history since, well, centuries prior. Initially serving as the Emir of Kilwa Kisiwani, essentially the judicial authority on the island and an important administrative position, Al Kawab was elevated by his brother Suleiman following the seizure of power, and not too long after, was even elevated to the position of vizier, the second most powerful person in the sultanate. And strangely enough, Al Kawab would end up politically outliving his brother by a pretty wide margin. Just a year and a half into his reign as sultan, Suleiman had made himself so thoroughly unpopular that he was overthrown by the populace of Kilwa and banished from the island for life. However, surprisingly enough, Al Kawab, the vizier of the sultan and his brother, was allowed to remain in his position of power. The chronicle doesn't state precisely why this was allowed to happen, and you'd think that the removal of Al Kawab's brother, the guy who appointed him in the first place and whose rule he would have likely been tied to pretty heavily, would have put an end to Al Kawab's political ambitions as well, but no, it didn't. Now, this is more than a little speculative, but it is worth noting that later sections of the Chronicle will make Al Kawab out to be an extremely skilled negotiator, and a man who was fantastic at positioning himself at the center of any debate as the mediating middle ground. And while, again, it's largely speculative, it seems plausible that Al Kawab was able to stay as vizier because he skillfully positioned himself as a middle ground in Kilwa's politics, and a moderating force compared to the tyrannical sultan. One who could easily keep a sense of stability and continuity without the tyrannical style of rule that his brother brought with him. Or perhaps he was kept around following the coup because maybe he was involved. Maybe Al Kawab had conspired with the population to overthrow his own brother and, as a result, was kept in power. Regardless, Al Kawab survived the uprising and soon began to exert an ever-growing influence over how Kilwa was governed. Much of Al Kawab's coming political success can be attributed to his flexibility, with Al Kawab routinely resigning his political positions and taking up new ones, depending on what would be convenient for him at a given moment. Whenever he did this, he would ensure to fulfill his old political position with a hand-picked successor, one who he could easily control. See, a year after the deposition of Suleiman ibn Yarik, Al Kawab decided to resign his position of vizier and appoint himself as the new emir once again. However, to replace him as vizier, he then hand-selected a prince with only the vaguest of relationships with the royal family. This meant that he was lacking any sort of independent claim to power and owed the entirety of his role and power to Al Kawab himself, rendering him as little more than a puppet of the emir. Eventually, Al Kawab began to exploit the political instability that followed even further. Over the next 4 years, 2 separate sultans were elevated but characterized as tyrannical and overthrown. This was especially to Al Kawab's advantage because he, as the true power behind the sultan, was able to leverage any unpopular policies he wanted to strengthen himself, but was able to utilize these sultans as scapegoats for his unpopularity and have them be deposed instead of himself. Over the next 4 years, 2 new separate sultans would be elevated, but once again characterized as tyrannical and overthrown. Al Kawab took perfect advantage of the situation. While the chronicle elaborates very little, it does state that there was, quote, confusion among the people of the land as a result of the constant overturn of monarchs. And so, with few viable options remaining, Al Kawab made the choice to elect a weak candidate to the sultanate, allowing him to control all 3 of the most important institutions of power in Kilwa. This puppet king would rule over Kilwa for the next 5 years, returning a degree of stability to the throne, but one that would not come without a challenge. See, this decision to appoint a new Sultan of Kilwa would end up finally resulting in the first very serious sign of resistance that Al Kawab would face. While his older brother Suleiman ibn Yarik had passed away in exile and was no longer considered a threat to take the throne, his son, known as Hassan ibn Suleiman ibn Yarik, had recently become an adult and was very interested in leveraging his uncle's goodwill and elevating himself to sultan. Knowing that his uncle was in power, it must have been quite the unpleasant surprise when Hassan ibn Yarik was informed that his uncle would take no interest in elevating him over his easily controlled puppet. Now, Al Kawab justified this pretty convincingly. He stated that, well, this wasn't a matter of personal power or politics, this was a matter of doing what was right. And after all, Suleiman ibn Yarik and himself were kind of junior members of the royal dynasty. He, nor his nephew, really had the right to unlawfully seize the sultanate, and they really should graciously delegate the throne to someone with a better claim. Now, as we'll see, this was an entirely disingenuous argument, and Al Kawab had not the slightest bit of principled opposition to the idea of appointing a member of his family line to the throne. No, instead it seems like this was a pretext to deny power to the prince, whom Al Kawab feared as a potential rival in the making. Of course, Hassan ibn Yarik did not take this lying down, and began to travel around Kilwa, raising any type of support he could for a chance to challenge his uncle for power. Eventually, he tried to seize the opportunity on the day that the Sultan of Kilwa had decided to go on pilgrimage to Mecca, leaving Al Kawab without his influential puppet to aid him. Hassan and his supporters launched an attack on the royal palace, but what is described as one of the bloodiest fights in Kilwa's history, the Fitna or Civil War of Ibn Yarik, Al Kawab emerged victorious. This time Hassan too would be banished off island, and his exile was never set to expire. With his final true rival defeated, it turned out that Al Kawab would be given one final major development of his political career. When the Sultan of Kilwa had gone on Hajj, several of his entourage had gotten sick and passed away. The Sultan and the surviving members of his entourage awkwardly wandered around Arabia for a few years, looking for any way to scramble together enough for a ride back, but were ultimately unable to cobble any sort of agreement together. In the end, they all died of sickness or were attacked by bandits on country roads. Now with no real rivals, and his puppet Sultan dead in a distant land, Al Kawab briefly appointed another puppet sultan to rule in his name, before he decided that it was time to drop all pretenses of power sharing entirely. After demanding that his final puppet sultan resign from his position, Al Kawab opted to crown himself as the new sultan of Kilwa, one that would rule with absolute authority without a single vizier or emir, with more power behind his name than any other sultan of the island since centuries long past. Any objection to crowning a member of his own distant branch of the royal family had apparently fallen to the wayside. Now, all of this took place over a pretty long career, and by this point in his life, the now Sultan Al Kawab was growing quite elderly, and his death was soon approaching. In the end, while his reign had provided a degree of continuity and stability, it had not done much to bring Kilwa into anything more of a prosperous state than it had been before. With his end soon approaching, he decided that it was time to relinquish his status as Sultan, handing it over to an heir closer to the traditional line of kings before ultimately passing away in 1495. With Kilwa now entering into the twilight years of the 15th century, a chaotic and humbling decade for the once great power, surely there was nowhere to go from here but up, right? A brighter day for Kilwa must be just around the corner. Well, spoiler alert, that is not going to happen. Indeed, the 16th century will be the single darkest chapter in Kilwa's entire history. Not only will all of the challenges of the 16th century mirror those of the last, but an entirely new and distinct threat will emerge and thoroughly transform the history not only of Kilwa, but of the entire world. Join us in our next episode, when the first ships from Portugal round the Cape of Good Hope and bring an entirely new challenge to Kilwa's front door. Thank you for listening to the History of Africa podcast. If you like our show, then we would greatly appreciate if you could help support the show and our project of freely available online history education. You can do this by supporting us at patreon.com/historyofafrica, providing us a rating or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, or by sharing the podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy learning about African history. This episode is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, including Naomi Kanakia, Iofagbamie, Dimitri, Alexander Travis, Bibi Milliam, Conrad Schwenke, Pascal Nwakocha, Joe Maxwell, Nkechi Nwabodike, Kwadwo Amankwa, Douglas Harder and Sherry Robinson, Craig Bolton, Samuel Badu, Ghassan Firjiani, Kitty, Mac T, Kelvin J. Norris, Ellen Fisher, Jessica, Tariq Beetleman, Yannick Bulnett, and Shixnay Brennan, among others. Thank you all for supporting the show. It really, 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 really means a lot.